So I'm going to be talking to you about consumer sovereignty in the Austrian tradition. And just to give you an outline, first I'm going to talk about Ludwig von Mises and what his understanding of the term was, because he's the one who started using it and made it something in Austrian economics. And then I'm going to go over Murray Rothbard's objections to the use of that term. Before I get going, let me just say this in case I forget later on. Everything I'm going to be talking about today, well, most of it, I have 2 articles on Mises.org in the daily articles section. So if you miss a point, a few of the arguments, it's a little bit like here's one view, and then I say, but what about this objection? And I go back and forth. So if you get lost and you want to reread lecture notes for this, as it were, if you just go to my archives in the daily articles on Mises.org, there's 2 articles. The one is something like consumer sovereignty, what Mises meant, and then the follow-up is Rothbard's objections to consumer sovereignty, or something like that. So anyway, there's 2 back-to-back articles that go over most of what you're going to hear in this lecture. Okay, so Ludwig von Mises, as I said, he, in many of his writings in Human Action and then more of his popular writings for the layman, uses this term consumer sovereignty to characterize what happens in a market economy. And to understand, especially in light of Rothbard's later objections, from our vantage point, we might say, well, why did Mises choose this terminology and stress this point? I think it has to do with the climate in which he was writing, because what happened, let's say, in the 1920s and 30s, was as socialism was becoming more and more politically popular, the intellectual elite, the sort of argument they would often make, would run as follows. They would say, during the horrible Middle Ages, what happened? It was kings and tyrants ruled over the masses, and then as the Enlightenment occurred and political institutions became more and more democratic, we overthrew these vestiges of past brutality and oppression in the political realm. And so now, as everybody would acknowledge, they would say that democracy is a much better political institution than the monarchy or oligarchy of days gone by. And what we need to continue this progress in human society is to apply that to the economic realm. All right, so that when it comes to the economic sphere, there's still these few concentrated individuals who have all the power concentrated in their hands, the capitalists or the property classes, whereas you have the mass of the workers, the proletariat, who, of course, are disenfranchised in the economic sense. So they were making an analogy to the political realm from the economic one, and so that if you were a defender of the free market, you were caught in this apparent unfortunate situation where you had to defend the equivalent of monarchy or oligarchy in the economic realm, and then no respectful person would do that at the time, and so therefore it seemed like if you believe in political democracy, then you have to be a socialist, because that's what democracy would mean in the economic realm. Okay, so there's plenty of rhetoric along those lines, and so I think that influenced Mises' decision to use this term and to stress it the way he did and the types of arguments he made that I'm going to now describe to you. So there's this common conception of a market economy in which, who's in charge, who makes all the decisions? Oh, it's the people with all the money. It's the big CEOs or maybe the stockholders if you're a little more sophisticated, but the bosses. So the worker, he makes no decision. He just goes to work and his boss tells him what to do, and then you say, well, who tells the boss what to do? Oh, well, his boss. And you can keep tracing it up the chain of command, but most people would think that, who haven't studied economics or really thought about the problem too deeply, they would assume that, oh, it's the big CEOs and they're the ones who are, maybe it's the bankers or the people who own the railroads, but those people are the ones who decide what gets produced in a market economy, at least one that was just pure laissez-faire, and that's why we need the government to come in and regulate these few individuals for the public interest, or if you're more radical, that's why we need socialism. All right, so that's a certain mentality, and that also is what Mises was really trying to knock down with this emphasis on what he called consumer sovereignty. Now, actually, Mises didn't invent the term. It was first used, or earlier used, by William Hutt, an economist who may have been mentioned in other lectures. His name is out there on the wall ceiling area in the upstairs library, and I don't know if Hutt coin the term, but he certainly developed it, and then Mises liked what Hutt did with it and incorporated it into his own work. So Mises, his main point on this is that it's actually in a market economy, it's not the producers, the CEOs and so forth who determine what gets produced, that ultimately it's the consumer, and hence the term consumer sovereignty. That in a market economy, the consumer is sovereign, Mises would say. And what he means there is that you need to take the analysis one step further than what I just did for the fictional depiction of the layman's interpretation, and say that yes, the person, the average Joe who goes into work at a factory, he does what his boss tells him to do, and his boss does what his boss tells him, and so on, and ultimately up to the CEO. And then you could say even there, well, the CEO is only there because of the shareholders, but even the shareholders aren't ultimately in charge. They're ultimately subject to the consumers, and the consumers, in their decision as to how to spend their money on different goods and services, they're ultimately the ones who determine what gets produced in a market. And so Mises has a few metaphors to describe this, and one of them is that he said, in a market economy, yes, the capitalists and the people running the banks and the CEOs, if you want to consider that they're the ones steering the ship, that's okay, but then realize that the consumer is really the captain. Right? So the consumers are the ones giving the orders, and then the capitalists and the entrepreneurs go out and execute those orders as best they can. And he often calls the entrepreneurs and the capitalists the mandatories, or mandataries, I guess. I think that's how you pronounce it. There might be an O in there instead of an A. But mandataries of the consumers. And what he means is those who act on behalf of. All right, so it's true, if you had a very naive, superficial look at a market economy, you might think that the people, the entrepreneurs and the people with all the capital were the ones determining everything and making all the important decisions, whereas the consumer is helpless and just has to buy what is produced for him, or is produced and then shown to him at the store. But in a very real sense, Mises says that all those people making those decisions are ultimately trying to anticipate what do the consumers want us to do with these scarce factors of production. All right, because that's the Austrian view of what happens in a market economy. And you've probably heard this in other lectures, but just to repeat the point, that you've got all these material factors of production, things that could be combined in various ways to make different types of output goods. And so one of the tasks of an economic system is to say, well, what should we produce? We've got all this labor, all this steel, this iron ore, and so forth, and rubber and deposits of natural gas and trees and what have you, and there's all kinds of things we could make with it. And so the question is, what ought to be produced? And so Mises says that ultimately in a market economy, the consumers determine that, acting through the profit and loss mechanism, that if somebody is suffering a loss, what does that really mean? Well, of course, in the first analysis, that just means they're spending more on factors of production than the consumers are paying for whatever it is they're making with those factors. And so Mises says that what that really corresponds to, what that's a signal of, is that those factors of production are more urgently needed elsewhere. So that, just to make it a diagram form, so you've got various inputs up here: land, labor, and capital goods. And then the entrepreneurs are in between, and they spend money on these things and then get the inputs, and then of course they make certain outputs. So they make watches and houses and every other possible good or service, haircuts, that get produced in the economy. And then down here you've got the consumers, and they of course give money in exchange for these things. And so the point is, what it means if a given entrepreneur is losing money, is suffering a loss, it means that whatever he or she is producing, that the consumers are spending too little on that good or service to compensate for how much the entrepreneur has to spend to get the inputs. And the reason those prices are the height that they are it's not just some arbitrary anomaly of a market economy and that the numbers could all be different and wouldn't make a difference. No, the reason that entrepreneur, because this isn't just one group of, I mean, this is a group of people, but they're different individuals. So you've got entrepreneur Smith and entrepreneur Jones, and the reason perhaps Jones is unable to profitably sell houses, that he's in the housing industry and he's losing money and he's got to get out of it, it's because the factors of production that he was buying in order to make houses, the lumber and the labor and the electricity to run the saws and things and just all that stuff, is more urgently needed elsewhere. The other entrepreneurs are paying so much money for those scarce factors that they're bidding them away. Okay, that's the language that would be used a lot in Mises' writings. That the other entrepreneurs, so the entrepreneurs are all competing against each other to bid these scarce factors away. And so where do the entrepreneurs ultimately get the money with which to buy those scarce factors? From the consumers of their products. So that's the sense in which Mises is saying, really, if Jones has to go out of business, it's, first of all, we shouldn't lament the fact. We shouldn't just cry and say that's so unfortunate. Jones was earning a living, and now how is he going to support his family? And gee, the government ought to do something to make it so that Jones can continue to sell houses. And isn't it good that people need houses? There's homeless people right now. We ought to have more houses being built. But that is a very narrow view. That just looks here at Jones and his customers. It overlooks the fact that if Jones goes out of business, then that frees up lumber and labor and other scarce factors of production that can be channeled into all these other goods and services. And so yes, there are potential houses that could have been built that now aren't going to be built, but at the same time there are thousands of other goods and services that now will be built because of it. And ultimately, when you want to say, well, how are we to decide which should be built and which shouldn't? Because again, there's only a finite amount of these resources. So we can't build as many of these things as people want. We can't just keep saying, well, let's build as many watches or make as many watches until nobody wants another watch. And the same thing with houses and haircuts and so forth, because we don't have enough inputs to go around to do all that. There's scarcity. We have to economize on our resources. And so a decision needs to be made. At some point we have to say, no, if we made one more house, that would withdraw inputs from all these other potential uses to make that extra house on the margin, and it wouldn't be worth it. That extra house is not valued by consumers as much as other things that could have been made with those particular factors of production. Okay, so it's the consumers who ultimately determine how these inputs get channeled into various lines. So if you're a paternalist and you think the consumers don't know what's good for them, then this argument's not going to be very compelling to you. That, for example, one of the goods being produced is cigarettes. All right, so there are entrepreneurs who are buying labor from agricultural workers, and they're renting out or buying the farmland in order to grow the tobacco and so on, and they're hiring trucks to ship the product, and all the factories that are involved in making the boxes and the cartons that you put the cigarettes in and so forth. All that stuff is taking up scarce resources in order to make cigarettes, and those things could be used for something else, right? That we could make more oranges to give to little children with the farmland that right now we're using to grow tobacco to make cigarettes. And so if you want to just say that I think the consumers are wrong in their spending behavior, okay, that you can say that, but Mises' point is he wants to make sure you realize it's not the market system as such that you have a problem with, it's the way consumers spend their money. Because if consumers weren't prepared to spend so much for cigarettes, then this wouldn't happen. All right, so it's not that capitalism somehow forces people to consume cigarettes, it's rather that the consumers are willing to spend so much for it, and the entrepreneurs, acting as their mandataries, acting as people on their behalf, then scramble in competition with each other in the input markets. And the reason firms can survive churning out so many cigarettes per year is that their customers pay them so much money that they can go out and compete away some of these resources from the other entrepreneurs. Okay, so this is what Mises means when he says that the consumers ultimately determine what gets produced, and that the entrepreneurs ultimately serve the consumers. So it's not correct to say that the shareholders or the CEOs are at the top of the chain of command in the economic system, Mises says it's ultimately the consumers. And it's captured in the colloquial phrase, the customer is king, and Mises even mentions that fact. And he said that that's actually not just an advertising slogan, but that's really true, that business people do scramble to provide what the public wants. All right, so that's the general gist of what he means by consumer sovereignty. And there are a couple of cases where you might think that this isn't really upheld, and I think it's instructive to go through those cases to clearly see what Mises' point is. So one thing you might wonder about is you might say, well, wait a minute, what about a case where apparently the owner or the producer really doesn't cater to what would be most profitable, but does something that satisfies his or her own subjective ends. So for example, if you've got somebody who lives out in the wilderness in this pristine forest, and so he owns the land, and so let me get rid of this. So somebody's out here and he's got his house, and he's, as I say, he's in the forest somewhere, and there's nature, there's deer running around, and this is all his land. And then some developer comes up to him and says, look, we want to put a shopping mall here on this portion of your land, so why don't you sell us this? We're going to clear all these trees out and put up the shopping center, and we'll give you whatever it is, $50,000 to buy this land from you. Now, a naive interpretation of the argument I just presented, you might think that according to Mises, this person would have to sell this because the consumers would much rather have this land being devoted to servicing a shopping mall and having all the things that can be purchased there, rather than lying idle, just satisfying this one guy's enjoyment. And that if this person says, no, I don't want your offer, I won't accept your offer of $50,000 for this parcel of my property, and I just prefer to leave it the way it is because I don't want to have traffic at all hours of the day, and I like to be able to just take a stroll around my land and not be disturbed by all this commercial activity. If the person says that, you could say, well, how much money is he getting from that decision? And you would say, well, he's not getting anything. That the consumers aren't paying him to rent this land out for natural purposes. Right? It's not as if there are tourists coming through, nature lovers who are hiking through his land, and they're paying him more to keep it pristine rather than to knock it down and put a shopping center there. So this looks like it's a counterexample to Mises' claim. But it's not, or at least let me tell you what Mises' response would be. He would say what that overlooks is that the guy who lives here himself, he is both the owner of this land and also a consumer. And so the way Mises handles this type of case is he said, if this person does renounce the bid for $50,000 for this land and chooses to leave it as it is, as nature originally produced it, then really what's going on is he's the owner of this land and he's consuming $50,000 worth of his income by purchasing from himself the right to enjoy this land in its natural form. Now, let me change the example a little bit in case that strikes you as a fishy way to get out of that little problem. Suppose instead of the owner of this land living right here, I instead said that, no, the owner is over here in a different state. So this is the owner of this piece of land. And this person just owns this portion. So he owns the land that his house is on, but this immediately adjacent piece of property, which right now is natural, it just has trees and foliage and there's all kinds of squirrels running around, that this is actually owned by this person who lives on the other side of the country. And now the shopping developer approaches this person and says, yes, we have plans, we'd like to knock down all these trees on your property, put up a shopping center, so on, and we'll give you $50,000 for it. And he's prepared, he says, sure, I'm not getting, this was given to me by my uncle when he just passed away, I don't get any money off of it, it just sits there, it's a tax liability. Sure, I'll sell it to you for $50,000. Now this person hears about that, and he doesn't want that to happen, because he likes going out and having this nice pristine area right next to his house. And so he calls this guy up and says, I'll tell you what, if you will agree to keep your land the way it is, I'll pay you $50,000 and 1 cent. Or if you prefer, I want to buy the land from you for $50,000 and 1 cent. And so could you just do that instead? And so if this guy, you can see him agreeing to that he would, sure, what does he care whether or not there's a shopping mall? He's just going to do that which gives him the most profit or the most return from his property. And so if you can see, and clearly in that case, when this guy would agree, okay, if you send me $50,000 and 1 cent, then I'll keep my property the way it is, then obviously this totally fits in with Mises' notion of consumer spending determining how scarce resources get used. That this person is willing to spend more to keep this land being used as nature rather than all these masses of consumers who might go to the shopping center are willing to indirectly pay in order to have the shopping center right there. So if you see how it would work here, then it doesn't change too much if I just say, imagine this owner and this person happen to be the same person. And that's the sense in which if he renounces the bid for $50,000 to knock this down and turn it into a shopping center, then he's $50,000 poorer than he otherwise could have been, and yet he's satisfying his own subjective preferences to keep the property devoted to its current use, which is providing the services of enjoying nature. All right, so that's the way Mises handles apparent cases where it looks as if the producer is not catering to his customers entirely, but his own subjective preferences are somehow altering his decisions. Another case that Mises uses is he says, okay, suppose there's some guy who runs a business and he's got 2 candidates for the position, and one of them, he has an opening, and so he has 2 candidates for the job opening, and one of them is clearly superior in all respects relevant to on-the-job performance, but the other candidate is his brother-in-law. And so he could hire the brother-in-law just to placate his wife, and that would also seem to be as a case where the business owner is not acting on behalf of the consumers. That, right, according to the consumers and what they care about, it seems as if the first candidate should be hired, because the first candidate, by stipulation, is more productive in terms of on-the-job performance, and so whatever service or good that business owner is selling, he's going to have more of it to sell if he picks the first guy, whereas the second guy isn't as productive, and yet he's hiring him just based on his personal situation. So that also, a Marxist would probably point to that and say that's an example of nepotism, and that's the sort of thing that happens in a market economy where the capitalist class or the owners get to make arbitrary decisions without considering the impact on the community. So again, how would Mises deal with that type of case? He would answer it analogously with what I did with this case. He would say, really what's going on there is the owner is considering all the options at his disposal, and if he does in fact choose to hire the less productive person, what's really happening is he's suffering an opportunity cost, he's suffering a lower return from his business in order to keep his wife happy. And so in a sense, he's acting as a consumer by spending his possible income on that particular outcome. And it's a little bit strange that normally people don't go out and spend money in order to ensure that someone gets hired, but there's nothing in principle to rule that out. So if I had told you that he hired the first guy and had therefore more revenues from his business because he had a more productive worker, and then took that money and went and bought his wife a diamond ring to keep her happy because she was mad at him for not hiring her brother, there would be no question as that consumer sovereignty was being upheld, right? That the factors of production would be arranged in such a way that the materials for the diamond ring got channeled into making that diamond ring, and then that's now on the wife's finger. But there would be no objection, oh, that's just due to the arbitrary whims of the property owner. No, you would say he was spending his income in his role as a consumer in order to channel those resources into that realm. But if instead of that, if he thinks, no, I would rather have $10,000, or I would rather hire somebody who's going to produce for me $500 per year less revenue in order to keep my wife from getting mad at me, rather than going out and buying a $1,000 ring, let's say, well, then that would be cheaper for him, right? That he would hire the slightly less productive person who earns $500 less for his firm than the other candidate in order to keep his wife happy. So it's a little bit more complicated than if he had just went out to the store and bought something, a gift to sort of make peace with his wife. But ultimately, what is he doing? He's suffering a reduction in his potential income in order to make something happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. And that's, economically speaking, not really different in principle from if he just hired the more productive worker and then with that $500 went out and bought something. Okay, so that's how Mises deals with these types of objections. But again, I don't want to get lost in these little complications. The overall picture is that it's not the subjective preferences of the owners, of the people making the decisions, that ultimately counts. That you could be a producer of novels, you could be some publishing company, and that doesn't mean you would publish the novels that you yourself want to read. If you want to stay in business, you have to produce the novels that consumers want to buy, even if you personally think that they're not very good novels. Or there might be someone you think is brilliant, and the person gives you the manuscript and you tell them, I'm sorry, I can't publish this because it's a business decision. I personally think your manuscript's great, but I just know I'm going to lose money on this. And so I can't help you. And so that's what Mises is talking about when he talks about consumer sovereignty. Now, what's interesting is that you might be inclined to think, given the pro-market emphasis or perspective that Mises has, which we've emphasized this week, you might think that Mises would say, oh, consumer sovereignty is always upheld in a market economy, and only when the government comes in and distorts things is it violated. But that's actually not true. Mises does think there is a possible case, even under a pure laissez-faire market, where consumer sovereignty is not upheld, and it is the case of monopoly price. And so Mises says this is the one case where, even in a pure market economy, it's possible that the owners of the factors of production, the entrepreneurs, do not act on behalf, they're not mandatories on behalf of the consumers, but they're actually, that their interests and those of the consumers diverge in this case. So that's another way of putting it. To say that there's consumer sovereignty is just an application of the idea that there's a harmony of interests, the phrase that Bastiat used, that there is no, in the final analysis, there's no conflict between the interests of the workers and management, that they're all better off cooperating and having a division of labor, and there's ultimately no conflict between what the customers want and what the owners want or the entrepreneurs want, that there's gains for trade there, and that ultimately a society based on private property and exchange fosters an environment where everyone's better off than any other system. Okay, but again, Mises isn't just blindly asserting that and then saying, yep, and the market always achieves that. He's saying, no, hypothetically, if we had monopoly price, that would be a case where the consumers are not being perfectly served by entrepreneurs. Or another way of putting it is the search or the drive to achieve profit does not lead entrepreneurs to do that which is in the best interest of the consumers when there's a monopoly price. Now, I keep saying monopoly price as opposed to just monopoly because Mises is he said this is a very specific case. It's not enough if someone just owns all of the factors necessary for some particular good. That alone does not mean that person is not going to obey the wishes of the consumers. There has to be a monopoly price, and I don't want to get too deeply into this because I don't know if all of you have an economics background, so if you lose me here, don't worry. This will only take a few minutes, and then I'll go on to Rothbard, and most of it won't rely on this particular point. But for those of you who have studied economics, let me just explain what the argument is. Mises says that the only time a monopolist doesn't act on behalf of the consumers where his personal interest doesn't coincide with the interest of the consumers is when the demand curve, and if you had a competitive price, so PC is the competitive price, if this happens to be on an inelastic portion of the demand curve. All right, and so if you, for those of you who studied economics, just recall, if you have a demand curve, generally speaking, there's a region where the demand is elastic, and then there's a region where it's inelastic. And what those terms mean is that given, so again, the demand curve, you've got price and quantity, it's downward sloping. So that just means as the price of this product goes up, consumers buy less of it. Or if the price goes down, they buy more. And so what happens is that there's a certain region, namely the inelastic region, where if the price goes up, yes, consumers buy less, but total revenues go up. Because total revenue is price times quantity. So as long as demand is downward sloping, yes, it's true that if price goes up, you know quantity is going to go down. But if price goes up, let's say by 10%, and quantity only goes down by 8%, then total dollars spent on this good go up. All right, so if you are a monopolist and the competitive price happened to be in the inelastic portion of the demand curve, and then let's say you bought out all your rivals and now you alone control the industry, it would be silly for you to keep the price down here. You know, you of course would make more profit by raising your price up to the monopoly price. Let's say it's up here, so PM. Even with, and I don't even need to tell you anything about what it costs to make these things, because for sure you're going to raise it at least this high to where it switches over from being inelastic to elastic. Because even if I had a stock of goods that were costless to produce, if I just had, for some reason, someone just gave me a bunch of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something, those lunches that if you have children and they go to this, you go to the store and you get those portable lunches, they're called Lunchables, the thing I have in my, well, that might be the new thing. When I worked in a grocery store, they were Lunchables. Maybe they're those now. But they're, you know what I'm talking, they have the little compartments in there, and so the parents who don't have time to make their kid lunch, they just go out and buy these things, and they have little compartments with cheese and crackers and pre-made sandwiches and whatever in a little juice box. But there's turkey or meat in there, and so it does go bad. It expires. And so what I'm saying, even if you had just a bunch of those that were given to you for some reason, and you had 1 million of them, and you had to decide what price should I charge for these things, you would never charge a price in the inelastic portion of the demand curve for the Lunchables. You would always charge at least the price where inelastic switched to elastic, and because again, what that means is you could just throw away some of them and then sell the remainder, because you know that as I restrict the quantity I sell, I can charge a higher price. And so if we're in the inelastic region, then you know that yes, as the quantity goes down, I can raise the price by a more than proportional amount, and hence this total number gets bigger. So that's what inelastic means. It means that prices go up more than proportionally for a given percentage drop in quantity. Okay, so again, I don't want to get bogged down in this. I'm just showing you for those of you who know what this stuff means. So Mises' point is that it's not enough if you're a monopolist, because suppose the original competitive price happened to be up here, then so that when there were 10 firms making these lunch products, the price was up here and the quantity was down here, QC meaning competitive quantity, competitive output, and then one firm buys out the other 9 competitors, and so that person has a monopoly in the perishable food industry for lunch products for school children. It wouldn't immediately follow that they would restrict production and raise prices, because they would make less total revenue in that case, because they're in an elastic region. That yes, they could raise prices 10%, but consumer demand, the quantity demand, would drop by more than 10%, because by hypothesis we're in the elastic region, and that's what it means when you're in the elastic region, that if you raise prices by X%, quantity demanded drops by more than that. Okay, so Mises, do you have a question? Right. Right. Yes, if you're doing a standard microeconomics analysis, that's what's going to happen. So that's consistent with this, but Mises is just saying here the inelastic, for sure, if it's an inelastic demand, then what you're saying is it's going to be a different optimization point. Let me, if I have time, because Rothbard deals with that stuff. So to answer your question, Mises never directly addresses that particular claim. So for those of you who aren't following him, he's saying that there's another way to go about this where the monopolist really would always raise prices, and so that seems to be inconsistent with Mises saying that the monopolist wouldn't raise price if it's in this region. But it would get technical. Rothbard does try to deal with that in Chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State, so that's the answer I would give if you want to look at that or afterward. Yeah. No, because it gets strange, and I need to move on after this, but what happened, so his question, he's saying, how could the competitive price ever be in here? If you can lower price and get more total revenue, then why wouldn't you do that? And the answer is that, first of all, this isn't showing the cost of production, that you have to produce more if you lower the price, and so it might be the case that you would rather get lower total revenues but have lower total costs at a lower level of output. And also, if it's competitive, then each individual firm isn't perceiving this overall demand curve. They're looking at their own demand curve, and in the neoclassical framework, it looks like that. And so the firm says, I can charge the competitive price and sell as much as I want. If I charge less than that, I can still sell as much as I want. If I charge 1 penny more, my sales go to zero. So we're getting into mainstream economics, but the way this could be possible in mainstream economics is because they say the individual firms in a competitive market don't perceive the market demand curve, they perceive the individual demand curve. But anyway, I'm just repeating Mises' argument, and it's true, as you point out, that I think he actually neglects a certain consideration, but what I want you to realize is it's not that Mises says anytime someone is the sole seller in a given market, therefore consumer sovereignty is violated. He's going to say only if the producer sells at a monopoly price that's higher than what the competitive price would be, is it the case that the consumers are harmed. So the implicit idea, to go back to the case where it might harm the consumers, the idea is that really the market ought to be producing this quantity, and yet when the monopolist comes in and buys out all his rivals and raises prices up to PM at least and restricts quantity at least this much, then that's somehow violating the wishes of the consumers. Okay, so anyway, I just bring this up to show you that Mises he didn't just automatically assume that the market was always serving the consumers. He said there is this hypothetical case. Now, having said that, he also goes on to say in the real world, all the important cases of monopoly are due to government intervention, either tariffs, which sort of form a cartel of the domestic industries, or specific regulations prohibiting competition in a certain field. Right? So the obvious example would be utility companies, where the local government gives an outright monopoly to whatever your power company is, so nobody can come in and compete with them. Okay, so let me now move on to Rothbard. And as I said, he's critical of this entire, just about everything I've said. And I don't know if it's something that you want to say is good or bad for what Rothbard did here, because in Man, Economy, and State, where he makes most of these arguments that I'm going to present to you, I think all this stuff is in Chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State. And even if you're not going to, because the book's this big, even if you're not going to read the whole thing, if you're an economics major or just interested in economics, I would really urge you to read the Competition and Monopoly chapter. Like I said, I think it's 10, because it's one of the best in there, and it's great. And he goes through and talks about the mainstream approach and shows certain fallacies with it, and I really strongly encourage it. But for this, it's funny because Rothbard doesn't actually ever mention Mises in connection with the term consumer sovereignty. So when Rothbard critiques it, he attacks Hutt, because Hutt, as I said, was the one who started using this term first. And so depending on your view, if you love Murray Rothbard, you're going to say, oh, it's because he didn't want to go out of his way and criticize Mises, and isn't that cute? Whereas if you're someone who hates Rothbard, you're going to say, oh, he's being intellectually dishonest and not alerting the reader that his own mentor Mises did this, and why isn't he mentioning that? So I just bring that up so you'll be aware of it. So what was Rothbard's objection to all this stuff? Well, first of all, he didn't like the term, because the word sovereignty has a political connotation, meaning somebody who is in charge. That if in a certain region you say, who's the sovereign? Oh, the king is sovereign. That means he has authority, political might over his subjects. And Rothbard wants to say that's not at all true of a market economy. There's no sense in which the consumers are sovereign over anybody else. And so Rothbard proposes instead, he said, look, if you want to use that phrase, then we need to say individual self-sovereignty, by which in a free market everyone is the owner of himself and his property, and that he has the right to decide how his or her own property is going to be used. And that's the extent of it. And then, of course, you make voluntary exchanges on the basis of what you own legitimately, but it's really misleading to say anybody is sovereign over anybody else. So that's one problem he has just with the terminology. And then another argument he makes is that, look, even if you wanted to continue with this metaphor, and Mises does continue the analogy between democracy and the political sphere with the market economy, and Mises said things like, in a market economy, every penny spent is a vote cast for a certain disposition of the means of production. And so if you remember that diagram I had with the consumers, the entrepreneurs, and the factors of production, the consumers, when they're spending their money, when they're buying cigarettes, those consumers are saying with their limited number of dollars, I'm voting that the entrepreneurs use at least some of the land to grow more tobacco to make more cigarettes. And the people over here who are buying oranges are saying, well, we're voting with our dollars that we want some of that land being used to grow oranges. Okay, so that's the idea. And Mises says that the market economy, there's a plebiscite held every day in which every penny spent is a vote cast for a certain disposition of the resources. So Rothbard doesn't like that. He said, first of all, as I say, it's wrong to use political terminology, but also beyond that, it's unfair to the market. That it's not at all a compliment to the market to say it's similar to democracy, because what happens in a democratic election is that you have a limited number of choices, and you know you're going to be stuck with one of those people as the politician. It's not that you can just say, well, I don't like any of those guys, and so I'm going to opt out of the system. That you know, no matter what, one of them is going to be the governor or the president or what have you. And so even if you cast a vote for one of them, that doesn't really mean that you consent to the whole process and that you're a voluntary participant. And again, that, for example, maybe you wanted somebody else who's not on the ballot for whatever reason, right? And so that's your vote for George Bush or John Kerry should not be construed to say, oh yeah, you support them the same way that when you go out and buy cigarettes that you really agree that you want those things to be produced. And then another argument he makes is that in a democracy, it's winner take all. That if 60% vote for one candidate and 40% for the other, the 60%, they get their person in charge, and then he's also the governor or the president of the minority. And so they all have the same person. Whereas in a market economy, it's not that everybody spends their dollars and says, this is the type of shoe I want, and someone else says, oh, this is the type of shoe I want, and then one shoe gets made and shipped to everybody, and we all have the exact same shoe. That's not how it happens. People have different sizes and different colors and styles, and it's not that the same model car is mass-produced for everybody. There are different types of cars, and people go out, and so there's specialization. That there are niche markets where people who have really unusual preferences or needs, somebody who's 7 feet tall probably has to shop in a special store or order his clothes from a certain catalog, whereas other people who have more normal preferences and sizes, they can just go to the mall to get their clothes. All right, so it's not at all as I say, a compliment to the market to say it's like a giant plebiscite every day in which dollars spent or pennies spent are votes cast. Okay, because in a market, minorities can be served as well. It's not that the majority determines everything. Now, as far as the stuff I was doing with the monopoly pricing, Rothbard also takes on this argument, and I can't get too technical with it. And again, if you have studied economics, I urge you to go look at it in Man, Economy, and State. But as far as this alleged case where the monopolist, if he does in fact raise price above the competitive level and sets a monopoly price, that this is a violation of consumer sovereignty, Rothbard wants to say, well, the problem with that argument is there's no such thing as this competitive price that we can contrast with the real world so-called monopoly price. That if you have somebody who's out there selling computer software at $100 per unit, and you want to say, oh, that person's a monopolist, and that really the competitive price ought to be $84 per unit, Rothbard would say, well, how do you know that? What do you mean when you talk about the competitive price? That all we can really talk about is the free market price, that the price established when people voluntarily exchange their legitimately owned property, and there's a certain numerical exchange rate, and that's what the price is. And what sense is there to talk about, well, is that price higher than the so-called competitive price? Because there always is, if you have a legitimate free market, there's always the opportunity for some outsider to come in and produce in that field. And if they don't want to, if nobody else can profitably undersell the so-called monopolist, then in what sense, Rothbard wants to say, is that person outlawing competition, or is competition not being allowed? Okay, so that diagram, I'm not going to put it up here again, but where I had the P subscript C and then said if the P subscript M is higher, Mises says, oh, that's a violation. Rothbard would just say, what is this P with the subscript of C there? That there's no such thing. Now, Rothbard goes on to take on the epitome of the example of a producer who's violating consumer sovereignty, where you have somebody who actually destroys some of the product in order to get more revenue from consumers. So this often happens with agricultural products, and I think the case Rothbard uses is somebody who's growing coffee. And so you can imagine, suppose somebody grows 1 million bushels of coffee, and just given the demand of the market, the person would actually make more total money by burning 200,000 bushels and selling the remainder, rather than trying to dump the entire 1 million on the market. Okay, so again, the idea is if you dump the whole 1 million on the market, the unit price would be pushed so low to get consumers to buy every last unit of it that your total revenues would be lower than if you actually burned some of it and then sold the remainder. Okay, and that's logically possible that could happen. And in fact, there are apparent historical periods where you do see people intentionally destroying agricultural products in order to raise their prices. And I'll come back and talk about that in a minute or two. So how would Rothbard deal with this? Because clearly that seems like a clear-cut case where, yes, the consumers of coffee would much rather have the producer sell those units on the market and then rather than burn them up. Right? That seems like an obvious case where the coffee owner is not acting in the interest of everyone else in society, but is narrowly focusing on his own gain. Or more specifically, where his profit-maximizing behavior does not lead him to do that which everyone else would want him to do. So Rothbard responds to that, and one point he can make, I'm not sure if he says this, but one point to make is that all these real-world examples where that sort of thing happens, if you go in and look at the situation, it's actually often because of a government-established cartel. So it really is the case that during the 1930s, while people were starving in America, that people who owned farms were intentionally destroying prunes and so forth, and oranges and what have you, while people were starving to death. And the Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck points that out, and he thinks that's a feature of the capitalist system, like this horrible system where you've got the starving guy out here looking at the big wealthy owner who's actually destroying food, and isn't this crazy? But no, what happened there was under the New Deal, in order to help the farmer, there were price supports, and so the government actually ordered all the farmers, you can only sell so much on the market, and it's against the law if you try to sell more than your quota. And so the farmers were just following what the government ordered them to do. But suppose that that's not the case. Suppose we really do have a legitimate example where a private property owner happens to have this surplus amount, this 1 million units of coffee, and would make more money by selling 800,000. So what Rothbard points out is this isn't the sort of thing that's going to happen very often. That yes, after he burns the 200,000 and sells the 800,000, the next time he goes and plants coffee for the next harvest, he's going to try to make it sure that he only grows 800,000. Right? That he's using land to grow that extra 200,000 that he ended up burning. That's not making him any money. He's going to make even more by next time growing the amount he plans on selling. And so if nothing else, this isn't going to be a rampant problem with the market. That yes, it was a mistake the first time, but it's not going to happen again, or at least the profit mechanism does encourage people to not do that sort of activity. But even on its own terms, you want to say, okay, sure, but that act of burning the coffee, clearly that's a case where the producer is not acting in the interest of the consumers. And even there, Rothbard wants to say, well, it's not so obvious, because let's switch examples. Let's say that somebody is a fireworks producer, and he makes 1 million bottle rockets, and he sells 800,000 of them on the market, and then the other 200,000, he invites all his friends over. He lives on a lake, and he has his worker go out to the middle. There's an island in the middle of the lake, and he just launches them all off and blows them up in the sky, and everyone is looking at them and thinks it's great. Then you wouldn't say that's a violation of consumer sovereignty, because that's like the case where the person lives in the natural area, and he doesn't sell the land to the developer, that he's consuming the good himself. And so in the same way here, the person who owned the 1 million bottle rockets is consuming 200,000 himself and then selling the rest to the consumers. And you can say, okay, but the difference there is what bottle rockets are supposed to do is to be blown up, whereas the hypothetical case where that person had 1 million bushels of coffee, the coffee is not intended to be burned, and clearly the person there is burning it only to raise his revenues. He's not burning it because he's a pyromaniac. And there, so what Rothbard points out is, look at how far I've pushed you back now, the person who wants to maintain that there's this possibility that consumer sovereignty is not upheld when someone destroys the product, that now we have to get inside the head of the person doing the destroying and ask, why are they doing it? All right, so that, again, just to make sure you're following me, if somebody has a bunch of apples and then goes out and picks some and feeds them to his family, or just goes out and eats them, no one's going to say, oh, that's a violation of consumer sovereignty because you could have made more money by selling that rather than eating it. No, clearly that would be a case where you're the owner and you, in your role as consumer, are consuming some of the product yourself and then selling the rest to other consumers. And so in the same way, you grew all this coffee and you destroy some of it, you burn it up, and so why aren't you just consuming 200,000 bushels of your coffee? And that if the first case isn't a problem, but the second one is, then it seems like your motivation is at stake. And you can make it even more complicated and say, what if the person who blows up the 200,000 bottle rockets, what if his profit maximizing number is 800,000? And so the reason he's got 200,000 that he wants to blow up is because that's what's going to make him the most money. And so he says, well, given that I'm going to blow these things up anyway, why don't I invite all my friends over and we'll have this fantastic show where we blow up 200,000 bottle rockets. And so there, they are deriving satisfaction from the rockets from their intended use, and yet you could say the real reason he's doing it is because he wants to maximize his revenues. And so what about that case? Is the person serving the consumers or not? And it's, as you can see, that gets really complicated because, well, who are the consumers, the people who enjoy the bottle rockets being blown up, and yet it seems like he's violating the wishes of the consumers, even though all of the 1 million bottle rockets are being seen by some people blowing up and providing satisfaction. All right, so as you can see, it gets really complicated, and again, it's difficult because you have to get inside the head of the person making the decision and say, well, why is he doing it? Is he doing it because he wants to consume or because he wants to get more monetary profit. So that was Rothbard's, how he deals with even the most absurd case where someone physically destroys product before selling the rest on the market. So let me take questions now. Yeah?
What if you think the situation such that 800,000 you also will sell in terms of things in the United States market, but the other 200 you want to maybe dump that into another market, like say Canada or something, and maybe things like undercutting, you want to make anything, just cost cover production costs, right? But you don't really care that maybe the price are lower anyway, and you just want to go there and just get rid of those something on the market. So, is there an opposite perspective on that?
Okay, I would repeat the question in case people listening to this didn't hear you. So the question is, what if instead of destroying the 200,000 units, you sold it in a different market and got a lower price? I don't think Mises or Rothbard ever talked specifically about that. My guess is, for sure, Rothbard would say that's fine. You're just doing that which maximizes profits, and you're serving consumers in different markets, and then what's the problem with that? Mises, my guess is he would say that's not a violation of consumer sovereignty, that resources are being channeled to where consumers are paying for them, and that the consumers in the poorer country are paying more for those 200,000 than would ultimately be paid in the other country, and that's just by the fact that you're getting more total money by splitting up the sales that way. So but no, I don't think they've ever specifically talked about that.
But, empirical activities of that are related to government management. Because they subsidize agriculture and they overproduce, and they have an incentive not to restrict their production on their own to increase their profit, but rather to produce as much as they can, sell what they can to maximize their profit, and then they have an incentive to overproduce and then don't, which destroys other markets because all their dollars produce that's the direct result of them being created overproduction.
Right, and there's also, if you talk about pharmaceuticals, for example, the big thing is that U.S. companies develop them and sell them domestically for a far higher price than they sell them in Africa or even Canada. But there's all sorts of laws about banning bringing those products back in here. So of course, how could this huge price difference exist between the U.S. and Canada? It's because there are regulations in place that something that sells for $100 in Canada and sells for $200 here, you can't just buy it cheaply there and bring it across the border and sell it here. There's all sorts of regulations against that. So that's another thing, that a government policy that supports what you're talking about. But in principle, if it happened on a free market, I think both Mises and Rothbard would say, yeah, that's fine. There's nothing objectionable. Yep. Yes, Mises doesn't directly deal with that as far as I know, but Rothbard specifically critiques the neoclassical views of welfare economics. But you're right, if what you're getting at is the standard neoclassical argument against monopoly is that the gains to the monopolists are more than offset by the losses to consumers. Rothbard at least deals with that stuff. Mises, not so much, and I think it's just because Mises was educated earlier, and then Rothbard was younger, and so when Rothbard went to graduate school, he learned all that stuff and knew it fresh, and then went to attack it. So I think that explains why the difference in treatment. Any other? Yeah, 1 minute if any other. Okay, thanks.